One of the podcasts is Swimming America, the Air Tour Sports Podcast. It is Thursday night, March 7th, 2024, people. Also Friday, March 8th, 2024, depending on when you're listening. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody is having a great day. And as we have done, we will do the Thursday night live show on YouTube. It is a crazy time. It is a busy time. And I want to go ahead and get this show out to you as soon as possible. By the way, been a crazy week. We appreciate everybody's support tuning in to the Tuesday night recap, the Wednesday night recap, and we have ourselves a loaded Thursday night, Friday show today. It is all college hoops because it is that time of the year. We are going to talk about what I believe to be the only 8 teams in college basketball that are capable of winning the national championship. I'll give you all 8, their strengths, their weaknesses, and who I ultimately think can cut down the nets. From there, we'll take a quick break, and I think there are some developments on the Louisville job. ACC tournament is next week. I think Kenny Payne could be out within 24 hours after Louisville loses, so that thing is going to move quick, and there is a new name at the forefront of everything. Finally, we will wrap a busy weekend in college hoops, as it should be. Final weekend of the regular season. We got Duke, Carolina. We got Kentucky, Tennessee. We got Houston, Kansas. A bunch of big games. We will preview them all to wrap the show. A couple things before we get started. One, want to thank, as always, our partners, BetUS and BetUS Sportsbook. Listen, BetUS has been with us for a few weeks now. They are with us through all of March Madness, and we are so excited to be working with them because they have an incredible offer for listeners of the Aaron Torres pod. How about this? See that little link in the description if you're on YouTube. See the link in your show description on Apple or Spotify. Click that link. They will give you a 125% deposit match on your first 3 deposits. Your first 3. So you put in 100, they give you 125. You lose all that, put in another 100, they give you another 125. On and on. First 3 deposits up to $2,000. So thank you to BetUS and BetUS Sportsbook. We appreciate their support. Also, before we get started, I mentioned this the other night, but we are selling our March is for Day Drinking t-shirts, okay? I got to be careful because I knocked out my mic on Wednesday night when I shared it the first time, but our March is for Day Drinking t-shirts, they are fire. They are the shirt that you need for March Madness, for your parties, for your get-togethers. Click the link. Go to aarontorresonline.com/merchandise to get yours. Now, by the way, for the Husky fans listening, I am wearing my Maura Hurley 24 t-shirt, baby. The only ticket you should support in 24. We don't get political here on the Aaron Torres pod, but Maura Hurley is a ticket that we can support. All right, we've wasted enough time. It is a Thursday night. It is Friday when many of you are listening. There is no more time to waste. So let's get to the topic of the day. The topic of the day, let me say this, okay? So it's interesting. Over the last couple weeks, I've had a few of you kind of ask me a couple different things. One, I've had people say, Torres, there's 3 weeks left. There's 2 weeks left. There's a week left. What is your Final Four at the beginning of March, at the beginning of championship week, at the beginning of whatever? I'm here to tell you, I don't really do mid-season Final Fours, pre-tournament final. I need to see a bracket before I get too excited and before I start picking teams. And so we talked about this a little bit on the Wednesday night recap show. But essentially, rather than doing a pre-conference championship Final Four, what I instead want to do is this. I want to go through the teams that I believe can legitimately win a national championship, because I think the group is smaller than in most years. And it was funny on the Wednesday night show, I had a lot of you ask me like, okay, who are some dark horse Final Four national championship contenders? And I believe this is a year where there is separation at the top, where those top 6-7 teams, I think, are just better. And I think we're going to see kind of a favorite heavy Final Four over these next couple weeks. Said it on Wednesday night. I don't believe that this is the year for a Loyola Chicago, a George Mason, a Florida Atlantic, whatever. And I think for the most part, if you've been good all year, I think you have a good chance of getting to the Final Four. And so what I want to do now is give you the only 8 teams that I believe can win the national championship. Before we get to it, one last thing. I know there are analytics that tell you, okay, you have to be top 15 this and top 10 that, and your offense has to be this and your offense has to be that. To me, when I look at teams good enough to win a national championship, essentially what it boils down to is one simple question. It is, do you have the dudes? Do you have the players to win 6 straight games against 6 different opponents, 6 different styles, etc.? Every year, people ask me, Torres, what is the secret to winning in the NCAA tournament? It's not having a number 1 seed. It's not playing in your region. It's not having fan support. It is, can you beat different teams playing different styles? I've told this story a million times. The day after Virginia lost as a number 1 seed, I remember talking to an assistant coach who had been part of multiple national championship teams. And he said, Aaron, unless that offense improves, you cannot win playing that way. You can't beat 6 straight teams doing that. Well, Virginia's offense improves the next year. They win the national championship, but that has always stuck with me. Are you versatile enough to beat different teams playing different ways? And if so, who are those teams this year? So let's get to those teams and let's work backwards from number 8 to number 1. And I'll start with number 8, and I'll say this. I don't think it's likely, but I do think it's possible that at number 8, the Duke Blue Devils can win a national championship. And I know what you're thinking, Torres, Duke, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But first off, they were my preseason national championship pick, so I got a little bit of a soft spot for them. But when I look at Duke, it boils down to the question that I just asked a minute ago. Do they have the players? Do they have the guys that can win 6 different games against 6 different teams playing 6 different styles? And I believe that they can. First off, and I've said this a few times, it feels like nobody is like this is the first year I can ever remember Duke really hasn't been discussed all that much on the national stage. They're 24-6. What is crazy is they started 5-3. Late November, early December, they lose back-to-back games, one of which I was at Arkansas, and then they played Georgia Tech in their ACC opener. They lost those 2 games to fall to 5-3 overall. Since then, Duke is 19-3, and nobody's really talking about them. Their only losses at Carolina, really good team, at Wake Forest, whatever. Wake Forest is good, even though they're not playing like it of late. And of course, the Pitt game when Jeremy Roach, one of their most important players, was hurt. Well, Duke is healthy. All 4 of those guards, 3 of those guards are playing really well. Jared McCain's playing well. Tyrese Proctor's playing well. And Jeremy Roach, I think, is their most important player. Kyle Filipowski, the big guy. Yes, if you didn't know Kyle Filipowski's name 2 weeks ago, you do now. But he's a really good college basketball player. He's actually projected to be a pretty high profile NBA draft player. And listen, they shoot the ball well. They have good guard play. And what's interesting is I don't know that they have guys that can take over games totally the way that UConn does, or that a Jamal Shed at Houston does, or that Tennessee does, whatever. But again, they got 3-4 guys that can get hot on any night. And I think, by the way, we'll learn a lot about them this weekend. ACC is a little bit down. Have they been beating up on bad teams, or have they turned a corner? There's some advanced metrics that tell you that they've actually been one of the better teams as they've gotten healthier. I have Duke at number 8. I do believe they can win it all, but I think things would have to break their way. Number 7, don't know if this is a controversial one or not, but I'm going to say it. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible that the Kentucky Wildcats can win the national championship. Now, I know what everyone's going to say, Torres, they don't play any defense. And I get it. And again, I get that there are analytics that will tell you that if your defense is the way that Kentucky's is, that you are going to struggle to win 6 straight games. I get that. But what I keep coming back to is a few things. One, what did I say at the top? Do you have the dudes to compete at the highest level and win the games that matter in March? Kentucky does, and they've proved it over the last couple weeks. One at Mississippi State, one at Auburn, destroyed Alabama at home. And I go back to Wednesday night. I know it was Vanderbilt. I know Vanderbilt's not good, but they basically weren't playing well for 15 minutes of that game. And all of a sudden you look up, they got 45 points, and all of a sudden you look up, they got 93 points, and they ran away with that game. And when I look at that team, They have 7 or 8 guys that could get you 20 points on any given night. There is no team in the country like them. And what I don't think enough people are talking about is that it's not just Reed Shepherd and Rob Dillingham, the 2-star freshmen. It's not even Antonio Reeves, the 5th-year senior. You know, quietly, DJ Wagner, former number 1 recruit in America, is playing as well as he has since he got injured about probably 6-8 weeks ago. He's been playing really well the last couple weeks. Justin Edwards, I think over his last 8 or 9, is averaging like 14 points per game. Had that 30-point explosion against Alabama. And so I just bring it up because when I look at this Kentucky team, everybody's worried about the defense. I get it. But it's all about matchups, and this team can score on anybody. 91 points the other day against Mississippi State. That's a good defensive team. Arkansas, you could criticize, but when they want to play defense, they can. You put up 112 on them. Even the Tennessee game. Tennessee, they played Tennessee this weekend. They lost the first one, but they scored like 94 points. And so with this Kentucky team, do I think they will? I don't. But are they capable? Absolutely. And I will say, I think this conversation becomes much more interesting if they win at Tennessee on Saturday. They win against Tennessee on Saturday. I think that's going to open up a lot of people's eyes. I think they are capable of doing it. Let's go to number 6 on the list of the teams that I believe can win the national championship. Number 6, drum roll, please. It is the North Carolina Tar Heels. By the way, hate to brag, but if you remember, I think I was the only person in the national media in the preseason that had North Carolina in my preseason Final Four. By the way, for all the crap I get, preseason Final Four was Duke, Carolina, Tennessee, Creighton. Looking pretty good right now, neither here nor there. With Carolina, though, listen, they've been the same team that we've talked about all year. RJ Davis is a star. Armando Bacot is kind of the hard hat, do all the little stuff guy, rebound, energy, hustle, dive on the floor, whatever. And they just have really nice pieces around him. Cormac Ryan, the transfer from Notre Dame, is averaging double figures, shooting the ball well. Harrison Ingram is averaging double figures. And so this team has been awesome in ACC play. And obviously, again, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of numbers, but defensively, they are a completely different team than they've been in years past. Now, my concern with Carolina is pretty straightforward. My concern with Carolina is that basically a couple things. One, are they too RJ Davis reliant? In other words, like RJ Davis is great, but do they have that second or third guy that can take over a game? I'm not sure that they do. Pretty much everybody else in the sport does. I'm not sure that Carolina does. The other thing, and this is kind of back to the ACC conversation, okay? The ACC is really down right now. NC State's not good. Notre Dame's not good. Louisville's terrible. We'll talk about their coaching search in a minute. Syracuse is not very good, although they're certainly better post-Jim Boeheim, just like I told you they would be. And so I bring it up because are these teams really good, or are they just beating up on bad teams in the ACC? I still think Carolina can do it. I do think they're very RJ Davis reliant, but the one thing I like, all those pieces fit. Everybody knows their roles. Everybody buys in. Another game that will be absolutely fascinating come this weekend as Duke plays Carolina. Let's keep it going. Number 5 on the teams that I believe can win the national championship. I'll be honest, they play tonight. We're recording here Thursday. It's 6:15 Eastern time. The Arizona Wildcats. So if Arizona goes to Pauley Pavilion and loses by 80 points, pretend this conversation never happened, but I still believe in Arizona because Arizona, they're kind of like Kentucky. They've had ebbs, they've had flows, they've had peaks, they've had valleys, but at the end of the day, they got dudes that can take over games. And so I don't need to see them win 15 straight because I know how good they can be when the bright lights come on. We talked about Arizona a few weeks ago. They have 6 or 7 guys that are going to play in the NBA. Now, all of them aren't going to be there next year, but Caleb Love is going to be playing in the NBA next year. Pella Larson going to be playing in the NBA next year. Some of their younger guys, KJ Lewis, Jaden Bradley, I believe it's going to take a little bit of time, but they will be playing in the NBA a few years from now. And so they have the talent. And the thing about Arizona, I do wonder, are they just a little bored in Pac-12 play? Because it's kind of the opposite of Duke and Carolina. Duke and Carolina lost a lot of big games in the non-con, but have been great in a watered-down ACC. Arizona's kind of the opposite. They won at Duke. They beat Michigan State on a neutral. They beat Wisconsin. They could have beat Purdue in Indianapolis. So they've proven they can play their best against the best teams. I just wonder if they're bored, or are they, have they regressed over the course of the season? I think we'll find out a little bit about them over these next couple weeks. The LA schools in LA this weekend. Also worth noting, the Pac-12 tournament, they will probably, if they win this weekend, their 2 games, they'll be the 1 seed. They will have a decided home court advantage. By the way, I'll be in Vegas next week. Cannot wait to check out the Wildcats in person. My only real concern with them, and I think this is interesting, have they become too Caleb Love reliant? It's kind of interesting. Caleb Love, I think he tried to do too much at North Carolina to the detriment of that team. It seems as though at Arizona, they've kind of let Caleb Love cook, which is great. But there has been some regression from guys like Keyshawn Johnson, what's the other guy? Kylan Boswell, on and on. I do still think Arizona can turn it on, though. And the one thing I'll tell you is this. A lot of conversation. Are they going to get the 1 seed in the West? Is Tennessee? They get that 1 seed in the West. They are going to have a huge home court advantage if they get to the Sweet 16 at Staples Center, Crypto.com Arena. Also, they will have a huge home court advantage if they could get to the Final Four, which, of course, this year is in Phoenix. Arizona at number 5. Number 4, teams I think can win the national championship. Listen, we've talked about them a ton. I don't need to get too deep into them here. It is the Tennessee Volunteers. Listen, Tennessee, to me, everybody, every time you say anything, oh, what about Rick Barnes? Yeah, what about Rick Barnes? Listen, I mean, the guy has made a Final Four. He's made the Sweet 16 the last 2 years. And as we talked about on our Wednesday postgame show, remember, he made the Sweet 16 last year without Sakai Ziegler, who's probably his second most important player. And he made it without Dalton Knecht, who wasn't on the roster last year. So you take last year's team that made the Sweet 16, was a bucket away from the Elite 8, and you add Dalton Knecht and Sakai Ziegler, this thing starts to get really interesting for Tennessee. And so I've talked about them enough the last 10 days or so, but they defend. Dalton Knecht adds another level. And like Carolina, like a lot of these teams, it feels like everybody has bought into their role, bought into what they are supposed to do, and have bought into expectations in that program. I give Rick Barnes credit. Found Dalton Knecht in the portal. Now, I don't want to say found because a lot of people liked him. I don't think anybody thought he was going to be this. But Tennessee, to me, is good enough to win the national championship. Now, they got to win some games in March when it matters. I get all that. But are they good enough? Abso-freaking-lutely. Number 3. Speaking about they got a lot of stuff to prove. Purdue Boilermakers. So listen, everybody knows Torres has kind of had his differences with the Purdue fans and the Purdue fan base and whatever. Are they good enough to do it? Absolutely, though. Like the thing with Purdue, do I have my doubts? Yes. And my number one doubt is what I've told you since October. The thing with Purdue, why I worry about them. What did I tell you at the beginning? To win a national championship, you got to have dudes. You got to have NBA players. You got to have guys that can take over games. Zach Edey is the only guy on that roster that is going to play in the NBA. But they are better from last year. They added this kid, Lance Jones, out of the Missouri Valley, who's added another dimension to them. And really, 2 things stand out about Purdue, even though I have been critical of them. One, and this is important, they have the best resume of anybody in college basketball. Beat Tennessee on a neutral, beat Marquette on a neutral, beat Bama on a neutral, beat Arizona on a neutral that was in Indianapolis, so it was really basically a home court game for them, but nonetheless, they won. Just won at Illinois. So it's like, I can sit there and say, well, I mean, what happens when they face Tennessee or Arizona? It's like they've played them and they've beaten them. And so to me, they are good enough. Now the question becomes, will they do it? It's going to be very interesting to follow. And obviously, look, I think you can argue without a doubt there is no team that has more pressure on them in March than Purdue. Now, you could argue John Calipari has as much pressure as anybody. You could argue Rick Barnes has as much pressure as anybody. But as a team, every single guy on that roster, they are going to be feeling the heat the second they walk in the gym. Interesting pathway for them. They will almost certainly open in Indianapolis, so they will have a decided home court advantage. Listen, I'll say this. if you can't at least get to the Sweet 16 as the number 1 seed in Indianapolis, then there is no excuse and no one is going to feel any sympathy for you. I think Purdue is good enough. We'll see if they can do it. Listen, I do think it's a little bit of Final Four or bust for Purdue. They don't get to the Final Four this year. I don't think anybody's, going to question Matt Painter, but it's like, this is kind of the year you got to go ahead and do it. Purdue is the number 3 team on my list. Number 2 and number 1, listen, I'm not going to get crazy breaking down these two teams, but number 2 is the Houston Cougars. Torres. Torres loves those Cougars. We love those Cougars here on the Aaron Torres pod, okay? But when I look at Houston, a couple things stand out to me. And when I look at Houston, what stands out is pretty straightforward, is that they are just, first of all, what they're doing, and we've talked about this a little bit, but remember, this is a team that was in the AAC last year. They have stepped into the Big 12, which everyone says is the toughest conference in college basketball, and I believe it. They're about to win the outright Big 12 title if they take care of business on Saturday against Kansas. And so when I look at this when I look at this Houston team, it is unbelievable what Kelvin Sampson is doing. And we just kind of accept, oh, they're Houston. They've been awesome. It's like, no, that's really hard to do what they've done. They're playing well. Everybody knows about the defense. Number 1 in the country in fewest points allowed. Number 3 in field goal percentage defense. Great rebounding team, tough, whatever. Here's the other crazy thing about Houston that nobody talks about. They are now down 3 key rotational players from the beginning of the year. Terrence Arsenault, middle of the season, tears his Achilles. Basically, maybe their best NBA prospect, honestly. The backup point guard, Ramon Walker, has not been playing of late. And then Joseph Tugler, the big man, one of their backup big guys, is out as well. So on the one hand, you worry if that depth eventually wears them down as you keep playing into March. But what they're doing is incredible. I think it's also worth noting with Houston, we worry about the offense, but Jamal Shedd's playing like a first-team All-American. And on top of that, and this is important, LJ Cryer, the transfer from Baylor, they basically brought him in to be their bucket getter. LJ Cryer has had 20-plus points in the last 3 games, 15-plus in the last 4. He is starting to play his best basketball. By the way, not sure how much you can hear in the background. We got a crazy thunderstorm going on here in Southern California. If I cut out, midstream here, we'll see what happens. We got some thunder and lightning going on in the background here. Anyway, number 1, teams that I think can win the national championship, goes without saying, and I'm not wearing the t-shirt just because. But it is the UConn Huskies. By the way, if you're a UConn fan, get your Maura Hurley tee, AaronTorresOnline.com/merchandise. Listen, I've said it. There's nothing else for me to add about this team. There's nothing else for anyone else to add. It's funny, and we've talked about this, but sometimes on Twitter, everybody wants to go above and beyond what the last person has. There's no new ground to cover with UConn. What they're doing is incredible. The opportunity to go back-to-back is incredible. I said it on Wednesday. I think the opportunity to go back-to-back without returning the majority of your team is absolutely incredible. Again, the last time a team went back-to-back, it was Florida about 20 years ago, and Florida returned their entire starting 5. UConn lost its top 3 players from last year. They're all in the NBA, and they are just humming along, beating everybody, and better this year than they were at this time last year. I think the other key, which I mentioned on Wednesday, Alex Caravan, one of their returning starters from last year, had one of his best games in months on Wednesday night at Marquette. If he gets rolling on top of Cam Spencer, on top of Tristan Newton, this team is lethal. Now, we've talked about it. There's only 2 real weaknesses with this team. They don't have a ton of depth. They basically only play 7 guys. And I think it's interesting, Dan Hurley has played some of the freshmen more over the last couple games. I think 1, it's probably to kind of keep them out of the portal after the season. But 2, I think he knows I need another body or 2 that I can trust. But UConn is my number 1 team. So those are my 8 teams that I believe can win the national championship. Duke at 8, Kentucky 7, Carolina 6, Arizona 5, Tennessee 4, Purdue 3, Houston 2, UConn 1. As far as everybody else, listen, Kansas, I'm just over Kansas. They are who they are. They play 5 guys. They don't have any depth. They're not good enough. I'm out on them. Iowa State, I worry if they can score enough. They feel like a Sweet 16, Elite Eight capped type team. Marquette, I just don't know that they have enough size. Like, you just watch the UConn game, they just get beat up on the boards. There's a few others, but those are my 8 teams. All right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I actually want to stay on the college hoops, and I want to talk about the Louisville basketball job opening, because I believe, well, I don't even know that I believe, but we got a new report out of Louisville over the last couple days, and it appears as though a new favorite has potentially emerged. Take a quick break. We'll be right back. Producer Matt, I want to hear a word from our sponsors.
America's favorite sportsbook and casino. Live betting and racebook. We're celebrating 30 years with a historic offer. A 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits. Plus 10% gambler's insurance. Get started today. BetUS, where the game begins.
All right, everybody. I'm back. Good to be back. Appreciate a word from our partners there. Again, BetUS. BetUS has been awesome. Great stuff from them. We appreciate their support. Again, BetUS Sportsbook, 125% deposit match on your first 3 deposits. Couple things really quickly. One, make sure to drop your questions in the chat. We will get to them at the end. And other than that, I appreciate everybody's support. So let's switch gears. And let's get to an interesting conversation that I've seen start to make the rounds on the internet. Okay, so college basketball carousel in the next 10 days is about to go crazy, okay? Because I think we're all college sports fans, okay? And in college football, the carousel is kind of interesting. Kind of 2-3 weeks out from the end of the regular season, you kind of know who's probably going to get fired. And what's happened more and more in football is that you fire a guy 4 weeks out because you have to have a guy in place the second the transfer portal opens, not only to get new players, but to retain your own. College basketball doesn't quite work like that. Most coaches, except at Ohio State, get until the end of the season to kind of finish things out. But once those conference tournaments end, that's where the movement happens, and it happens really quick. And so with that said, Louisville is the job that, listen, we all know it's going to open. It's been weird. It's been bad. By the way, there was a weird thing in Louisville this week where they were hosting recruits. My buddy Nick Coffey was going off like, what are we doing? Why are you even allowing the staff to host a recruit when we know that Kenny Payne and his staff will probably be fired as early as next Tuesday when the ACC tournament opens? So Kenny Payne's going to be out. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we did our first real look at the job. What's kind of interesting about it is that 2-3 weeks ago, a lot of the candidates that seemed at the forefront have kind of fallen back, have had disappointing years. Chris Beard was at the top of the list. Ole Miss is struggling. They're going to miss the NCAA tournament. Eric Musselman was at the top of the list. Arkansas is struggling. Now, he's got a little bit more sweat equity built at Arkansas, but it's been a disappointing year. Jerome Tang, Kansas State, it's been a disappointing year. So a lot of the names that we thought were candidates don't feel as strong as they were, 5-6 weeks ago. Well, I bring it up because I saw an interesting report out of Louisville that there may be a new name worth kind of keeping your eye on going forward with this job. That name, it is Baylor coach Scott Drew. Has Scott Drew emerged as the favorite for this job? And so I want to give credit because I saw this come out of a Louisville radio station. Drew Diener, who hosts radio down there, he said this on his show on Wednesday afternoon, talking about the Louisville job opening. ESPN Radio said this. He said, Scott Drew is the number 1 target for Louisville. They are down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. That's how I would put it. But they've got to get an answer soon. They can't wait around for him to make a decision in April. I don't know who the number 2 is, but there's a clear number 2 that they think is highly gettable. Nothing's a done deal, but a guy that they absolutely feel like if they can't get Drew, they can get this guy, and they want this guy. That's where they are. All right, so Louisville reporter says that Scott Drew is the favorite. And let me just say this. I think it's interesting. It's not something that I have necessarily heard as him being the definitive favorite, but do I think it's out of the realm of possibility? I don't. First off, a couple things on Louisville. One, and I said this the last time we did the update, the good news for Louisville, the quality of candidate that they are going to have the opportunity to get here over the next couple weeks, whoever it is, Scott Drew, somebody else, it is going to be better than it was the last coaching cycle. Remember, last coaching cycle, you fired Chris Mack midseason. He didn't get fired. He actually quit. But Chris Mack leaves midseason. You're in the middle of an NCAA investigation. Chris Mack has his own investigation with the Dino Gaudio stuff. You don't really know what's going on. And so I don't think any of those big names were ever really interested in taking the job. Well, this year, I think you're going to get somebody more high profile. And I'll say this about Scott Drew. I do think he fits the number one criteria beyond anything else is it a guy that can ultimately win the press conference at Louisville? Okay. Because to me, that's the most important thing. I'm not criticizing Louisville fans, but it is a divided fan base right now. And you can't bring in somebody that half the fan base doesn't believe in from the beginning. So I think he kind of has that, press conference vibe where it's going to win the press conference. I do think that's important. And I do think there are a couple reasons why it would make sense for Scott Drew to consider the job. One, first of all, he's really accomplished. So again, that helps win the press conference, right? Has won a national championship. That's kind of a big deal. And to his credit, we're talking about a program at Baylor that has really been kind of in that top 10 to 12 teams in the country for about 5 or 6 years now. 2021 was the peak, but 2020, they were good enough to win a national championship before the tournament was shut down. This year, they're going to get a 2 or 3 seed. Last year, they had a pretty high seed. The year before, they were good. Won a championship in 2021. So he has the credibility. And 2, I do wonder if he's ever going to leave Baylor if this does kind of feel like the time. 1, it ain't going to get any better at Baylor than winning a championship in 2021. And as a matter of fact, it's only going to get harder going forward. First off, respect to Baylor, respect with what he's done. He has done an unbelievable job in building that program. But at the end of the day, let's call a spade a spade. Baylor is not Kansas. And so essentially, even before all the expansion, basically everything has to break right. Otherwise, Kansas has advantages that Baylor simply doesn't. By the way, so does Louisville. So does Kentucky. So does Kansas. So does UCLA. So there are certain jobs that it's just the standards are higher, but it's more realistic to meet those expectations. It is hard to win at Baylor, okay? And it is not going to get any easier as the Big 12 expands. We talk so much about realignment from a football perspective. You understand how tough the Big 12 has gotten in basketball? Kansas is humming. Iowa State is at a really high level. Kansas State has been a pretty consistent program the last 15 years. Now you're adding Houston. Well, Houston just walked in year 1 and is kicking butt and taking names. As long as Kelvin Sampson's there, they're not taking a step back. Arizona is coming in next year. That is another team that is built to have more success on a year in, year out basis than Baylor. It's just the truth. You don't have to like it. It's a fact, though. So you look at that, and I sit there and say, has Baylor as a program kind of capped? I remember during football season, I said, I don't think there's a bigger loser in football realignment than Penn State. Because Penn State was very clearly the number 3 team in the Big Ten, and you hope that maybe Harbaugh would leave or maybe Ryan Day would leave. You could get to number 2 or number 1. Well, now you still got Ohio State, you still got Michigan. But if you're Penn State, you have USC, you have Oregon, you have Washington, etc. And I kind of feel like the same with Baylor. You were the number 2, but some years you were better than Kansas and da-da-da-da. Now you got to be better than Kansas and Arizona and Houston. And you got to hope that Texas Tech doesn't figure things out and that Kansas State doesn't figure things out and that Iowa doesn't keep things rolling. Iowa State, doesn't keep things rolling. It's just becoming a harder place to win. And so I think if you're Scott Drew, you look at that. You look at the fact that he's 53 years old. And it does kind of feel like if there's ever a time that he is going to step away, now kind of feels like the time, doesn't it? He's 53 years old. He's probably got about 10 to 12 really good years left. Coaches are retiring in their early to mid 60s. And it's like, do you want to remain at Baylor forever where you're beating your head up against the wall? I know you got the new facility. I know it's a good job. but it ain't, again, the Kansas, Kentucky, Louisville, Arizona type job. And do you want to take one more run at a place like that? I think it's at least worth considering if you're Scott Drew. Now, I think from the Louisville perspective, it's interesting because a couple things. First of all, I want to backtrack to some of the comments because they did say they're down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. I think that's another thing, too, I didn't mention, by the way. It appears as though Scott Drew is at least willing to listen to other offers. We know that very publicly, it appears as though he is the favorite to replace John Calipari when John Calipari leaves Kentucky. So I don't think Scott Drew is leaving Baylor for nowhere. But I do think the right job could get him to listen. And so I think it becomes an interesting thing of if he listens. Now, this part was interesting. The part where Drew Diener said they are down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. That's how I would put it. But they've got to have an answer soon. They can't wait around for him to make a decision in April. What I think he means by that, and I don't want to quote him, but I think what he means by that is essentially that basically, like, we're kind of at the point where Louisville kind of needs to know, okay, like, we're not asking you to leave Baylor in the middle of the season to take the job. But if we fire Kenny Payne, when we fire Kenny Payne, are you going to take this thing? Because the one thing that Louisville cannot afford to happen, and I defend Louisville on this, I think they're right. They can't fire Kenny Payne next Tuesday, wait 2 weeks for UCLA or for Baylor's season to end, and then not hire anyone, assuming that Scott Drew is going to take the job. And so what this really comes down to is, do you know that he is going to say yes? And I think that's kind of the point. If you don't, they have to move on. Now, the stuff about waiting till April, whatever, that would only apply if Scott Drew made the Final Four. And if he does, I don't think he's going anywhere. But it does kind of feel like he's hit the ceiling there. And I do think it'd be a good hire for Louisville. Listen, I think there are other guys that are interesting, but everybody's got something, right? You know, Chris Beard obviously has off-the-court issues. Jerome Tang, Eric Musselman, as I said, are struggling this year. So I think Scott Drew would be good. I think it's interesting. I think the thing for Scott Drew, he has kept the program at a really high level, even post that 2021 championship. Because I'm one of those guys that was like, well, everything broke right. You had 2 or 3 guys that were ready to declare for the draft. Because of COVID, they come back. You steamroll everybody to win a national championship. But I think Scott Drew would be really good there. And especially in a down ACC, I could see him having success early. Really quickly, I thought the second part of that conversation was interesting as well. The part where they said, I don't know who the number 2 is, but there's a clear number 2 that they think has high gettability. It's an interesting point. Couple thoughts here. One, I still hear a lot of Mick Cronin buzz. And what I will tell you, listen, I've been making phone calls last month, all off the record. And like, what I would tell you with Mick Cronin, you hear stuff about whatever, but at the end of the day, he does still have like a $16 million buyout. And I think Mick Cronin would love to get that buyout brought down. And I think if it could, he would absolutely want the Louisville job. I think if he could just take the Louisville job with no strings attached, I think he'd probably take it. But I can't see UCLA, an athletic department that does not have very much money right now, even with the Big Ten. Remember, they still owe hundreds of millions of dollars. And oh, by the way, remember, they have to give Cal some of their money because they're part of the same school system. So UCLA doesn't have as much money as you'd think. And I just can't imagine just letting Mick Cronin walk for $16 million or something like that. So I'll believe that Mick Cronin is the legitimate number 2 candidate when I see it. Also worth noting, by the way, I think it's much more likely that that number 2 candidate is maybe either an Eric Musselman or a Jerome Tang. Both those guys have pretty easy buyouts to get out of. And so you're not talking about a Mick Cronin and Nate Oates that has a 10, 12, $15 million buyout. Really quickly, before we get out of here, fun show, by the way. First of all, drop your questions and comments below. We'll get to them at the end. Before we do that, we're going to skip Aaron Right, Aaron Wrong today. Let's just quickly preview the final week of the college basketball season. I'm not going to go super in depth. We know these teams at this point. You know their strengths. You know their weaknesses, whatever. So I'll just give you some quick previews and picks on the big games, and we will get out of here on a Friday. Again, we appreciate your support. Pumping out a lot of shows this week with the post-game reaction shows on Tuesday and Wednesday. So again, I don't think we need to go, 10 minutes each on these previews. But let's get to them really quick. First game, ACC championship on the line, North Carolina at Duke, 6:30 Eastern, ESPN on Saturday. So North Carolina won earlier this week, and with it, they did win they did win at least a share of the ACC regular season title. But because Duke is only a half a game back, if Duke wins this, then they would actually split the regular season title. Both teams 24-6 coming into this game. Both teams playing really well. As I said, Duke 19-3 since the first week of December. North Carolina, to its credit, only has 3 ACC losses all season long, and they have won 5 in a row and 6 of 7 coming into this one. Their last loss at Syracuse. Now, look, they haven't played the best of the best in the ACC, but they did win at Virginia. They did beat Virginia Tech at home, and have won 3 straight games coming into this one at home. So this will be the first time they go on the road. I think what's interesting about this one, couple things. First of all, you go back to the first time these two teams played. Harrison Ingram for North Carolina, the Stanford transfer, was awesome. He had, I think, 22 in that game. What's interesting, though, is that he really hasn't had those breakout games since then. You kind of felt like, okay, is this the game? Because for people who don't know, former McDonald's All-American goes to Stanford, decides to transfer. And I only bring it up because that first Duke game felt like a breakout type game where you sat there and said, wait a second now. Is that the McDonald's All-American that didn't really click at Stanford? Now he's rolling at Carolina. Hasn't really happened like that. He has games where he goes for 24 some nights, 11 some nights, 22, 3, 7, whatever. And so for Carolina, it's what we talked about earlier in the show in the teams that are good enough to win the championship. Do they have the consistent second guy behind RJ Davis? And I don't know if they do. Duke, on the other hand, listen, we make fun of them, but they're at home. They're playing their best basketball. It feels like all their guys are healthy, and they do. Duke does legitimately have about 6 or 7 guys, maybe not 6 or 7, but they have about 4 or 5 guys that can beat you on any given night. Jared McCain has played better of late. Tyrese Proctor has been much better. Kyle Filipowski, when he's not, being wheeled off like he was shot at Wake Forest, he's been playing good basketball. I mean, what do you have, like 30-plus points the other night in their most recent game? So I look at this game, and I do think that Duke at home gets the win. Don't know who would get the number 1 seed at the ACC tournament. Both these teams, I don't think they're really in consideration for a number 1 seed. I do think they'll probably both end up on the 2 line, barring like a shocking loss at the ACC tournament, but give me Duke at home. Next game I want to talk about, 4 p.m. Eastern, CBS. You talk about a fun rematch. Kentucky at Tennessee. Tennessee has clinched the number 1 seed in the SEC, outright regular season champs. And it'll be interesting, right? Because the question becomes, are they going to be – I think it could be an emotional day for Tennessee. Remember, they played back-to-back road games, just won the SEC regular season. And keep in mind, too, like senior day kind of is a big deal this year. Santiago Vescovi, Josiah Jordan-James. Those guys have been there since before COVID. They got there in 2019. 2019 doesn't even feel like something I can fathom right now. That's when they began playing college basketball, plus Dalton Connect obviously will be celebrated on senior day as well. So it'll be emotional. And I'll tell you, I think Kentucky's kind of coming into this game under the radar. They beat Vandy. They put up 112 against Arkansas. I think everybody says, well, the offense is great, but what about the defense? It's like, no, the offense is just great. And I could actually see this game going a little bit like the first game, only the exact opposite, where if you remember the first time these two teams played, it was at Rupp Arena. And Kentucky, it was an emotional night, an emotional crowd, Saturday night, college game day, etc. And then Tennessee came out and just took the air out of the building early. They were up like 22-8 or something. Kentucky rallies. They get it close, but they can't quite get over the hump. I could see that scenario where the opposite happens here, where it's emotional. Tennessee's a little sort of tiny bit flat. Kentucky, all of a sudden, you look up, they're up 22-8, 4 minutes into the game, 5 minutes into the game. But I'll just say this. I think if Kentucky wins this game, we have to have a real conversation about them. Like I said an hour ago, half an hour ago, that they can win the national championship. We'll see if they do. But I think they can win this game. I mean, I can't pick against Tennessee at home on senior day, but I'll say this. I think it's under 5 points. I think Kentucky can win this game. If this opens as like Tennessee -7 or something, take the points with Kentucky. I think they can win this game. Can't pick them to win. Credit to Tennessee. We'll see what happens. I'm fascinated by this game because, again, for the millionth time, I think Kentucky can win. Third game I want to quickly touch on, Kansas at Houston. Houston, again, can win the Big 12 regular season title. Listen, I think there could be a degree of like Kansas kind of having the moment of like, are you just going to walk into our league and just take what's ours? I don't really see that happening, though. What's interesting for this game, by the way, if Kansas loses this game, they will not get the double bye into the quarterfinals. So in the Big 12, the top 4 teams get a double bye into the quarterfinals. Even in the previous iteration, obviously there was the 9-10 play-in game. There were 2 play-in games, into the main bracket. So basically, Kansas has never had to play other than the latest possible thing. Kansas loses this game. They could potentially, this is crazy, they could finish in 5th, tied for 5th place in this league and be as low as the number 6 seed because Texas Tech would be ahead of them. And then they lose a tiebreaker to Baylor or BYU, who they only played once and lost. We could be talking about Kansas as the 6th seed at the Big 12 tournament. But at the end of the day, listen, I could go on and on. I think Houston's winning this game. I'm just out on Kansas. It's more of a bet on Houston. I believe in them. Bet against Kansas. I don't believe in them. I'm done with Kansas. Their flaws are obvious. They don't have enough depth. They don't shoot the ball well enough. They don't get enough scoring outside of, well, they get enough scoring from their 5. But I think Houston wins this game. A couple other ones of note, Florida Atlantic hosting Memphis is kind of an interesting one. Florida Atlantic isn't technically off the bubble, but they kind of are, but they kind of need this win. So yeah, I think that would be interesting in this one. I don't think Memphis, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. Memphis isn't really on the, so Florida Atlantic isn't really on the bubble from the perspective of, like really missing the tournament. They're on the fringes of like, if they lost this game and then they lost the first conference tournament game, maybe they'd be on the bubble. Memphis, on the other hand, kind of is the opposite. They need to win this game just to really be on the bubble and then needs to do damage in their conference tournament. But I'll tell you what, Memphis is playing well. 4 straight wins coming into this one. I'll take Memphis to pull off the upset in this one. Just trying to see some other games. UConn at Providence on Saturday night in Providence. Listen, there's no other way to really put it. Providence really kind of needs this win for their NCAA tournament resume. But I know that Providence played UConn tough the first time. I know the game is at the Dunk. I know it's a Saturday night. I know it's going to be crazy. I just find it really hard to see the scenario where Providence wins. They're so banged up. They're so beat up. UConn 27-3 on the year. We'll see if they can close with one more win. But yeah, I find it hard to believe that Providence is going to win this game. Interesting one in the Big East. Creighton at Villanova. Villanova, we talked about them on Wednesday. They lost to Seton Hall. Villanova kind of could use this game for their bubble conversation. I don't think this knocks them off of the bubble if they lose it. I also don't think that they are definitively in if they win it. This is more about helping their resume going into the Big East tournament. So that's an interesting one. Sunday, it's funny. Remember about 6 weeks ago, Purdue played Wisconsin at Wisconsin. It was a top 5 matchup. Well, now it's the exact opposite as Wisconsin is really reeling. They go to Purdue. It's obviously senior day, biggest game, final game of Zach Edey's time at Purdue. I think Purdue's going to win that one. Indiana, my boy Mike Effin Woodson, he's alive, baby. He ain't going anywhere. They host Michigan State on Sunday, so that'll be an interesting one. And I think those are really the marquee games. Arkansas at Bama. Listen, both teams are struggling right now. Bama will probably win. I do think an interesting one, an SEC game, A&M and Ole Miss are kind of both on the fringes of the bubble, need a win here and then need to do some damage at the SEC tournament. So that one is interesting. South Carolina at Mississippi State. Mississippi State, I don't really think is on the bubble, but a win here would help things. And finally, I think it's also worth noting, conference tournaments are underway. So we will have some auto bids clinched this week. The Ohio Valley will be Saturday. We got a couple games on Sunday. So by the time we come back on Monday, we will have some auto bids. Producer Matt, unless there's any great questions, I think we will get out of here here on a Friday. Again, by the way, I appreciate everybody's support. We've been doing these live shows, and we've been doing these live shows. The response has been great. Pat Turnbow asks, will Wade to Louisville? LOL. All I'll say is this. Stay tuned. I may have something to talk about on Monday's show as it pertains to that. Just go ahead and stay tuned. But I don't think Will Wade is a candidate at Louisville at this time. Could be at other places, but he's not there. Tell you what, I think that's it for this episode of the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. It's time for me to get out of here. 5 shows this week. It has been a fun week. As I've told you, a couple things. Monday's show. Details on the Aaron Torres Pod Bracket Challenge. You'll be able to sign up even before the brackets come out. A very interesting guest that I think you guys will enjoy on Monday's show. And we'll react to this crazy weekend of college hoops. And oh, by the way, on top of that, we'll react to the first batch of teams that are going to make the tournament. Also next week, Hassan Diarra, UConn guard, will join us on Monday. Then we'll do probably a conference tournament preview on Tuesday. And then producer Matt and I will be off to Vegas, and we'll be doing live shows from Vegas all next week. Monday's show, I will have some details for you on where you can meet up, maybe even watch the show if you want to. With that said, I do think it's time for us to get out of here. If you're not subscribed to the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast, please make sure to do so. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure to subscribe. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead, give us a quick 5 stars. Let's know what you like, what you don't like. Subscribe on YouTube. You want to do your boy a favor, go to YouTube, search Aaron Torres, turn on the notifications, click like, all of that good stuff. Really would help us grow. All for today's show. Thank you again for your support. I'll be back on Monday. Details on the Aaron Torres Pod Bracket Challenge, details on my Vegas trip, and oh, by the way, a very special guest that I know you will enjoy. Shout out to Torn. Shout out to Rachel, who hates my voice. Shout out to JJ Redick, you F-head. Unblock me, bro. I'll be back on Monday. New episode.